Mark Michael. 5 credits.
Thank you. Let's go. Word introduction to the first meeting of the year. Relatively unique committee. Housing mandates. It has 4 council members, but it has 2 invited members from the school board and 1 invited member from the planning commission. And while the regional mandate is the responsibility of the council, so the voting members will be the 4 council members. But it is essential, because this has a big impact on the school district and on the work of the planning commission, that we get input from those bodies. So the role of the committee is to have a full discussion, including the members of the school board and the planning commission. But when we get to a vote, the members of the council will be the voting members. The procedures will follow will be each item that's introduced. The staff will present the material, background material for the discussion. There'll be a discussion with the 4 council members, the school board members, the planning commissioner following that. And then the staff will have a chance to respond to any questions that have come up during that period, and then we'll come back to the council members for action. Public input is a critical part, and that will follow the initial presentation by the staff. Okay, that's the format of the meetings. So let's get underway, and the first item on the agenda is oral communication. Most important part where anyone from the public can speak to the committee on anything not on the agenda but within their purview. I have no cards. If anyone does want to speak, you just fill out a card and give it to the clerk. You will be recognized. Okay, with that then, we can move on to action item number 1. Hillary?
Thank you. I'm Hillary Gittleman, the planning director. I'm joined by Tim Wong, our housing expert on staff. I keep calling you an expert. No pressure, Tim. But we actually have 2 items, and I'm going to present the first one. Tim's going to present the second, but I expect this will be something of a collaboration on both topics. And neither one of them really require the committee's action, but we would like your review of these issues and any input or thoughts you have about these 2 topics. So the first topic relates to the use of existing units to satisfy a portion of the city's regional housing needs allocation. So I don't know how versed everyone in the room is on this whole requirement for a housing element and to plan for the city's regional housing needs allocation, but I'll just try and give a little bit of background. Obviously, state law requires that we have a housing element. It has been changed recently to require that our current housing element be updated by the end of January 2015. For the first time in the state law, there are some significant penalties if you don't meet that deadline. So we are embarked together on this journey to try and get that done. Every time the housing element is updated, one of the most challenging aspects of it is to identify sites and zone them to accommodate what's referred to as the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or the RHNA allocation. And what that is essentially is a number of housing units that a community must zone for. And the number is divided up into low, very low, moderate, and market rate units. By far the most challenging aspect of it is planning for the low and very low income portion of the allocation. In the midst of the economic downturn, a lot of communities were seeing a lot of foreclosures. So there was existing housing stock that all of a sudden was on the market, and communities were interested in using some of that existing housing stock to satisfy their regional housing needs allocation. And that wasn't at the time permissible under state law. So the law was changed to provide an opportunity for agencies to meet, in theory, 25% of their allocation for low and very low income units by using existing housing stock. And what we've given the committee is a staff report that explains how this is possible in theory, and with an attachment that was prepared by an attorney we work with on housing issues, which explains some of the complexities around this law. And I'm going to try and go over that briefly if I can. First, let me say that the city's regional housing needs allocation for this coming housing element is 1,988 units, and the low and very low income portion of that is just over 1,100 units. So if we were able to make use of this provision in state law, we could theoretically meet our requirement for 280 units by identifying existing units and either rehabilitating them or preserving them as affordable units. Now, if you read through the attorney's memo, you'll see that in their devious cleverness in Sacramento, they've crafted these rules in such a way that makes them virtually impossible to use, unless there happens to be a specific project or site, housing development in the community that we're already aware of, that's at risk and available for us to preserve as affordable housing. So just going through the discussion briefly, under the state law, there are three ways you can use existing units. You can convert existing multifamily housing or foreclosed housing to affordable housing. You can preserve existing affordable housing that may become unaffordable, or you can substantially rehabilitate existing units that are currently unfit for human habitation. The attorney points out that that third category has never been used by any jurisdiction. It's essentially infeasible. The other two are theoretically possible. The first would be feasible if we could identify market rate or moderate income apartments in Palo Alto or foreclosed properties that could be purchased and converted to restricted affordable housing. So we would have to know of an apartment building or a foreclosed property that had units that were rented at market rates or moderate rates that we could buy and restrict as affordable. We're not aware of any properties like that, but if the committee or the public is, we can talk about that opportunity further. The attorney we work with points out that probably the provision that's most feasible is the second one I mentioned, and that's if we could find existing deed-restricted affordable housing, so an existing subsidized project where the deed restriction is about to expire, so the units are considered to be at risk within the next 5 years. If there was a project like that where the city could commit funds to extend the restriction and therefore the duration of the affordability, we would be able to count those units. And the attorney pointed out in the memo that the Terman apartments were identified in the housing element as being just this kind of property, that it was at risk. But we've done some research, talked to the Housing Corporation, and we don't think that the Terman apartments are really at risk. The deed restrictions there have been extended already. So that property isn't going to be useful to us in this context. But if the committee or the public know of any other properties that are subject to deed restriction and the restrictions are about to sunset, that's, I think, what we would need to identify to make use of this provision in the law. And I did, Tim and I did have a conversation with the Housing Corporation. We just asked them offhand, do you know of any properties out there in the situation? And they were not able to identify any off the top of their head. So we have a little bit of time. You know, we can take the next month or so to canvass our friends and see if we can come up with something. But that really, in our view, is the only way we're going to be able to make use of this provision of the statute. So we'd be happy to answer questions about this.
Good. Let's start with questions. Karen?
Yes, thank you. And I left you a message saying I didn't expect an answer yet on such short notice, but I can't remember what year I saw Dina over there, maybe Dina can remember, what year our inclusionary housing ordinance was passed and when the Housing Corp started developing these affordable units, but I sort of think it was like 30 or 35 years ago, and so I'm thinking maybe some of the, I'm sorry? It was a long time ago, yeah. So I'm sort of thinking that maybe some of the projects that even the Housing Corp and the city have done, that some of those are coming close to expiring, so maybe those we could capture as part of this. That's the hope, and I don't expect you to have an answer to that yet, but that's one thing that I'd be interested in.
Well, we can certainly go back to the Housing Corporation and ask the question again. As I mentioned, we just asked them informally, and they weren't able to identify a specific project that might fall into this category. It would have to be something where the restrictions were going to expire within the next 5 years. But I'd be happy to go back to them and ask again.
Councilmember Holman, I believe many of the Housing Corp's projects, although they may have been done a while ago, they have received some loans to do rehabilitation through our CDBG program. And so as part of that, an additional or regulatory agreement would have to be executed as part of using those funds also. So that may have extended some of the sunsetting affordability clauses for some of those projects.
Okay. And thank you for this report, too. It's I've been wanting to look at this for literally years, back to when I was on the Planning Commission. And I have to say that going through this and reading it, and reading the attorney's perspective and such, it's another one of those things that leads me to think this isn't really about affordability. It isn't about providing housing. I mean, the restrictions in this are far beyond what they are for new units. You know, they're far beyond that. You know, so like now we don't have to, we just zone for affordable units. They don't have to be built. But yet, you know, if we're trying to retain existing units, the restrictions are they have to be completed within 5 years, and then you can't, if they aren't, then you can't use this same provision for the next cycle, and it's unbelievably restrictive, and I think runs counter to providing affordability in one's community. So that's my little tirade. But thank you for this. It's very, very informative, and I do look forward to maybe a closer look by the Housing Corp to see if we might have something that's we could capture that way. And then I don't know how much the Housing Corp reaches out to properties. I was a liaison for a couple of years, but we didn't come to this. I don't know how much the Housing Corp looks around for projects that, you know, might be a dozen units or 20 units or something like that. I don't know how aggressive they are in that. I did something I don't know. So, okay, thank you.
Councilmember Price.
Thank you for your presentation. I guess where I'm disturbed by this as I dive in now as a new member of this committee, is that, you know, we're given options that to a large degree are not feasible here, right? So we have, you know, tremendously high land costs. We have the costs for an individual to rent housing at whatever their income level is just so distorted. So I guess my question is, based on what I'm seeing here, I'm feeling like we're being painted into a corner, and how are we going to be able to do much of anything that has real meaning? And the Palo Alto Housing Corporation has done a person's job and has made tremendous efforts and has done excellent work over all these decades. But can a city take a position that the restrictions are so difficult that it's very hard to come up with these units in any realistic, timely way?
I think it is fair to say that these provisions have been crafted to make them very difficult to use. I don't think that was the intention of the authors when these bills were submitted, in the legislature, but through the legislative process, that's how they came out the other end. And they've been used in some communities. I think mostly in communities where they had a lot of foreclosed properties, during the downturn. Now that we're in a period of economic growth and rents and property values are high, I agree with you. I think it's going to be virtually impossible to use these provisions in a community like Palo Alto unless we just happen to have a project where the deed restrictions were about to expire. And if someone, I'm hoping actually just by having this conversation in the open at the committee, if a member of the public or the Housing Corporation or anyone is aware of such a project, they would come forward and we would be able to meet a tiny fraction of our allocation with this approach. And as the committee knows, if we can't use this approach, then we have to use the approach that every jurisdiction is bound to use, which is zoned sites for new units to meet these affordability levels.
Thank you. And just another question. This is not a new issue for cities. I mean, these kinds of struggles have been going on for a long time. So we have an attorney who specializes. We get consulting support. We also have internal expertise here. So my assumption is other cities have been facing this. Do we have any sense, or can we summarize in any way efforts made to go to the legislature and to revisit this? Or I know that's a whole nother arena, but to what degree have we briefed our legislators on our current challenges and opportunities, or lack thereof, in the city of Palo Alto?
Thank you, Councilmember Price. Cara Silver, Senior Assistant City Attorney. Palo Alto has long been on record in opposition to the housing element RENA allocation and the unfairness that it has caused with particularly built-out cities like Palo Alto. And so there has been certainly some internal pressure put on ABAG, which has some allocation authority. And last year we were lucky enough to have our mayor serve on that committee and was able to take part in some of those discussions. We have also had discussions with our own legislators about these issues, as has the League of Cities and other similar cities. But as of right now, and I think almost every year there is, some legislation pending to change aspects of housing element law. But there are certainly a lot of, constituencies that oppose that.
And just to clarify, my question is really more focused, and your response is absolutely right. I understand what we've been doing in this area, but my focus here is on this affordability piece, the low and very low income and affordable housing as an element of housing element, right? So that's where I'm sort of scoping in on this. I recognize the debate in the history regarding opinions about the ABAG numbers, but it's really sort of this particular element. And I suppose in the conversations you're talking about this particular element, I shouldn't be using the word element related to housing element. This particular part of the housing element has also been part of those discussions.
Yes, it has. And actually, in Palo Alto, we have not had difficulty meeting the very low housing allocation because of the Housing Corporation and nonprofits who actually do provide 100% affordable deed restricted. It's the more low-income category that is at issue. And the legislation now, the housing element legislation says that if you don't provide or you can't show that certain properties are going to develop as low income, then it sets up a default density and requires you to zone at a particular density, which is assumed to accommodate those income qualifications. And of course, you know, housing advocates, affordable housing advocates, are very organized and have opposed any legislation on getting rid of those default densities.
Councilmember Shar?
So actually, if I could just follow up on that, could you just quickly tell us what those default densities are?
For Palo Alto and many communities, they're 20 units to the acre.
So roughly as we go through this process, I guess I'll start at the beginning. First of all, thank you for bringing this us. I know this has been a lingering thought, whether or not there was some ability to meet our housing element doing this. And I'm really glad you brought it forth and explained it. And, you know, unfortunately, it seems like it's very, very difficult. Hopefully someone will come forward with something that works. Sort of skeptical that that will occur, frankly. But I'm glad we've, you know, dealt with this and thought about it and looked at it. And, you know, unfortunately with this stuff, there's really no silver bullet. I mean, that's how it always seems to me that, you know, we look at these things, and I remember last year what we looked at was the condo idea, right? We thought that might work, the condo hotel idea, and that was sort of nixed during the housing element review process by HCD, if I recall correctly. You know, I think it's good to think out the box, and hopefully we can come up with things that make this process easier. With that being said, hopefully as we go through this process, there will be things that make this palatable to the community. And I think this is going to be a tough process because we have, what, 600 and, it's in here somewhere, 690 units or something we need to zone for. And you said most of that is, how many new units are we going to have to come up with? How does that break out? Because it's the very low, and moderate, right? Do we know the?
I guess we're kind of assuming that we're going to need to come up with about 640 or 690 additional sites for an additional 640 to 690 units, and that those sites will have to be at 20 units to the acre, so they'll automatically count.
So that was my question.
Yeah.
So basically 690 units, basically at 20 units to the acre. That makes some sense. It's unfortunate, though. It's not an easy challenge. So along the lines of similar to this, and maybe now's not the time, but I actually would like to agendize the discussion of, I know that Atherton, Los Altos Hills, a number of communities who have mostly residential communities, the way they meet their housing element is they have granny units. And that may or may not be the way to go, but I think we should have that in the discussion. You don't have to zone for 20 units per acre to do that. You know, it actually provides real, somewhat diverse housing in a community. You know, if we build new housing units at 20 units per acre, even though they think they're going to be affordable, we'll know they're not. Not to say it doesn't add to the housing stock, but they're not affordable units. And they're usually run by professional managers who, you know, manage the county, the higher rents and stuff. So I'd like to see us see if there's some way to meet some of our unit requirements. And maybe it's infeasible like this, but that's the only other thing I can think of that may take us away from actually going through and coming up with 20 units per acre. I can't do the math in my head, but you know, that's what, 30-something acres,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
I mean, 30-some acres in Palo Alto seems like a massive challenge to me. It's not. You know?
Gun or tally, one of the two.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you're working on this.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we'd be happy to look at the granny unit issue at a future meeting. You know, my experience has been you can count those in some communities as moderate income units, but only if you can demonstrate that they're actually being rented at moderate income rents. So in Palo Alto, we may not find that hard and really only be able to count them as as market rate units. But we'll look into it. That's just off the fly, and based on experience in another.
There really is no silver bullet.
Yeah.
The housing element derived from 2006 and 8. It would be good if you could just give us a table on what the current definitions are of low and moderate income. Secondly, in here there is a table discussion on pages 61, 62 that list all the at-risk units in Palo Alto. Now they have the Terman apartments, but they also have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 others that are on a year-to-year.
Greg, can you speak in the mic?
Oh, sorry.
You might say what book you're referencing, but what document you're referencing.
Okay, the housing element book that we did approve for 2014 has a discussion in there of at-risk units, and it lists the Terman apartments, but it also lists 6 others that are on a year-to-year basis. Now, again, it would be good if you could just provide an update of that at-risk section to us as we get involved in these discussions. And I guess the third question is, I've been confronted with this a number of times. Why isn't the Buena Vista listed as an at-risk unit? It's probably the largest low-income housing site in Palo Alto.
Well, I think we probably will have to list it in this coming housing element as housing that's at risk in light of the current conversation. The question of whether we could count it rests on whether it meets the definition of assisted housing development. And that's included in your packet today. The checklist that HCD puts together has a whole host of footnotes at the end of it. And one of them is the definition of assisted housing development. And the housing you're going to preserve has to meet the low-income, low or very low-income levels, and it has to be one of these assisted housing developments in order to qualify for use in this.
Are you implying that it does not meet these criteria?
It does not.
Not that we're aware of.
Yeah, it might be helpful to explain where it doesn't.
Yeah, Councilmember Schmidt. The Buena Vista is not considered at risk for these purposes because it is not a deed restricted property. There are no affordable. Yes, the rents are equivalent to affordable rents in deed restricted developments, but there is no long-term affordability associated with the Buena Vista Mobile Home Park. Therefore, it does not fall under that particular at-risk table.
I thought it is zoned for a trailer park, and I thought that was, in a way, deed restricted.
The Buena Vista Mobile Home Park is zoned to RM30, I believe. RM15 or 30. But 15, oh, excuse me, yeah.
And again, I'd refer you to this section at the very end of the HCD checklist. It's the definition section, and you see all of the programs that include deed restrictions. Anything that falls under these programs would be eligible, but we don't believe that Buena Vista falls into any of these.
Okay, so that is an option to look. You're looking at packet page 10 to look through those 16 items, and anyone is free to see if they think it falls into some of those. Okay, school board member Tom, do you have questions?
No, you covered everything. I'm curious though.
Okay. I have 2 public speaking cards. Again, if anyone wants to speak, all you need to do is fill out a card and give it to the clerk. Each speaker would be given 3 minutes, and at 2.5 minutes, I'll give a signal that you've got 30 seconds. First speaker is Herb Borak.
Thank you, Chair Schmidt. In regard to Buena Vista, there are two different questions. One is, would it qualify for that 25% thing? And the question there is, that might be a negotiation with HCD. The other is, it's an affordable housing site that the council may have the resources to acquire. In regard to the Terman Apartments, there is some correspondence from them that's in your current packet. The last item in the second letters packet that was with your items for this week, in which they're applying to HUD for a mark-to-market rent increase. And so that is something from their point of view that would probably enable them to continue for a period of time. So that is another possibility. It's not the same thing as on the deed restriction, but that's something that also to work with HCD as a possibility for meeting their requirement. The Palo Alto Housing Corporation's website has a list of all their properties and the dates on which they began. So that's one way to get to a list of whether any of those are coming due. In regards to the changes in the procedures, I understood that staff said that currently we can just carry over the properties that weren't developed from one cycle to the next, but next time we're essentially adding one to the other. That if we don't fulfill part of a requirement, it's something that's then added on to next cycle's requirement. So it would be worthwhile to find ways to meet those requirements, since the next step from HCD may be that we actually do have to build them somehow or suffer some consequences. And considering what's been going on with the community and the concerns about the office development, what we may have to do in both downtown and California Avenue is to continue to have that ground floor for retail, but to say until that housing quota gets met, it's going to be housing and not offices, and the offices will just have to stop until we meet our HCD requirements. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Jeff Wrench.
Jeff Wrench from Barron Park, and I don't actually have to speak because I was going to bring up Buena Vista, and Chairperson Schmidt brought that up, so thank you very much. But I would just say, since I have this little spot on the microphone, please comb these 16 points. I'm not smart enough to be able to tell if any of them apply, but Buena Vista is in a desperate condition of representing a very significant loss of affordable housing in the town. So if there's any way this Section 2 can apply, that would be great.
Great, thank you. And our last speaker is Dina Moser. Welcome.
I don't know if I can make this low enough. I'll hold it. I just wanted to mention four things briefly. First is I want to remind the committee that the Community Working Group has been building housing in this community, that they built the Opportunity Center, just opened up 801 Alma, and also has a small property on Alma Street. So when you're thinking about people in the community who deal with affordable housing, the Community Working Group is definitely a player. The second thing I want to remind you is that we are losing affordability every day, unit by unit, as rents are raised. And it's no secret there is a vast cadre of low-income workers who power our everyday needs. So it's just the right thing to do, to be thinking about housing for people who don't make a lot of money, because we rely on them every day, and if they live elsewhere and come here, they have to park, they have to create traffic. You know, it's just not a good thing. Community diversity is really, really very important. I also just want to mention the homeless issue. I'm currently chairing the Homeless Services Task Force, and what's becoming clearer and clearer and clearer as we have our discussions is that across the nation it's being proven that housing solves homelessness, and nothing but housing solves homelessness. So again, homelessness is an issue that I know that you care a great deal about, and so don't think of housing as just this thing over here that's not related. It's related to community diversity, it's related to homelessness. And then, I'm not sure exactly what to say to you, but when you talk about zoning for housing, even affordable housing, it's really the easiest thing to do is to build the most expensive housing you can build. The hardest thing to do is to build the least expensive housing you can build. So our zoning ordinance need to make it attractive for someone to build lower income housing and not have it be the most attractive thing to build high income housing, because that's what you're going to get if you don't do something to discourage people from building it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And back to the council now for discussion, comments, requests, or actions. Councilmember Holman.
Thank you. I have a comment, and it's something I was going to bring up later under comments, and the city attorney will tell me if I'm straying too far. But what this item really highlights is, as I mentioned earlier in my little tirade that I called it, how, from my perspective, how misguided some of the programs are that are aimed at creating housing, and especially affordable housing. And Gail asked the question about communications with our state legislators, and we have done that a fair amount. And I will mention later, I guess, just kind of point to it now, that I'm hoping this committee becomes the voice of the council in talking with our legislators, so that we can speak with one voice and not one at a time as council members. But it also, you know, we've talked about how it doesn't make sense for these allocations to stop at city boundaries. And San Mateo County has a program where they can, I shouldn't say a program, they have worked out something where they can have agreement with other cities or other communities near them where they can do exchanges. And I think of this, and especially in light of Buena Vista and the heartache that is. Don't know yet what the outcome is going to be, but you know, East Palo Alto is a prime location for us to be able to save some of the housing that's there that really provides some of the workforce, and how much, who knows, but some of the workforce, certainly we can see it as people ride their bikes back and forth across, you know, the bridge into Palo Alto. So it just makes all the more sense for us to try to cooperate with other communities, and I would say especially East Palo Alto, to preserve affordable housing there. Which helps both that community in terms of affordability and this community in terms of having a workforce. So I'm just wanting to point to the need for us to heighten our communications with state legislators and League of Cities.
Thank you. Councilmember Price.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on Councilmember Holman's comment. About a year and a half ago, this issue came up at the City Council, which is related to the different methodologies used by different counties throughout the state of California. And what Councilmember Holman was referring to is there's an example of the San Mateo County method, which is a county-wide. They get together and work it out among the cities. And then you have the Santa Clara method, where each city gets their allocation, and then the duking it out starts. So, and I've worked in cities in Santa Clara. I'm serving in a city in Santa Clara, and the issues have been the same for 20 years. So my specific request to follow up here is, can we get information specifically about the Santa Clara methodology? I have spoken to housing people there, and I think we have a pretty clear understanding of the Santa Clara methodology. The real issue, though, when we brought this up in the past, was the planning director at the time, and he always did a very good job, said that would have to go to discussion with all the planning directors throughout the county. It would take many years of discussion. Maybe, maybe not. So the real issue here is not only understanding the methodology and the pros and cons of the, as I'm going to call it, the San Mateo method, although other counties use it. But what would be the path that we would take to see, certainly, are we interested in pursuing that? Are other cities within the county of Santa Clara interested in pursuing it? The other real difference is the size and the population of cities in San Mateo versus Santa Clara. And we have the big elephant in the room called San Jose. So there are a lot of differences, but maybe I think it's prudent to really talk about this in a sensible way. And then that way, engaging with other planning directors. The point is, though, is there political interest in this city council to pursue that? It has been raised in the past, and I'd be curious what my colleagues think, but it certainly seems, I don't know if it's appropriate to put it right out here, could we get an information item on this, on the two methodologies, maybe there are more, and what some of the implications might be, or is that worth moving forward? Or do we need a colleagues memo on this? So I'm laying it all out, comment, questions, but I'd love to hear your responses.
I'd be happy to respond, and actually have some experience in this because Napa County, where I was before I came to the city of Palo Alto, did a sub-regional process. We called it the San Mateo model. And we did successfully get through that process. But I'm happy to do a side-by-side comparison and talk about what the issues are. What I was hoping we could do, though, is put that off towards the end of the year, because it really has to do with how our next allocation would be distributed. And we have such a challenge this year to meet the current allocation. Maybe once we get that done and we're all exhausted, we can come back to this issue. And
That's a very good response, by the way.
Thank you.
So you're taking it seriously, but right now, the work plan.
Do it at the end of the year. That'd be great.
So it's interesting that we're having this discussion. So we're actually taking this up at the Santa Clara County Cities Association. And, sorry. So we actually have a working group on it, and we're taking up the whole reform issue and the issue of a sub-regional process. And maybe you know the answer to this, but my understanding of the San Mateo process is actually you do get your allocation, but then you can trade and work it out. That the cities don't give each other the allocation, that you get the allocation, and then you come up with you can trade or stuff. Palo Alto has to be a little careful in this. A lot of our neighbor cities believe that Palo Alto doesn't get enough, and doesn't get enough by a substantial amount. And so in a sub-regional process, you have to watch that San Jose actually is, huge. And if people actually sat down and voted on what allocation we got, we'd get a higher allocation. I think we all have to recognize the dangers in a sub-regional process. So one of the things we need to think about is a sub-regional process is good for us if we can trade, if we get our allocation from the state, frankly, like everyone else, and then we take that allocation and we work out amongst ourselves. One of the interesting things is a Caltrain corridor and that, and there may be real opportunities, for instance, to build housing in San Jose along the Caltrain corridor, which then serves Palo Alto. And San Jose has some interest in that kind of stuff, which would take some of our allocation. But they would want money for it. Let's face it, that's what the trading would all be all about. Is how much of your housing dollars are you willing to give, or transportation dollars through the MTCA. And so, it's not going to be a silver bullet for Palo Alto. And it's very different than San Mateo because cities are not of the same size. And, I know cities like Saratoga and Los Gatos and those places think they have way too much too. And Sunnyvale, if you look at Sunnyvale's numbers this year, Sunnyvale's numbers are actually significantly higher than Palo Alto's. And that's because their planning director recommended doing 3 PDAs, I think it was, or 4 PDAs, and our planning director only did 1 PDA. And so they ended up with a lot more housing. So, a lot of, this is these, PDA is Planning Development Area. And we made California area that rather than University Avenue and El Camino. So this stuff is actually really, really complicated. And, we have, 7 years, basically? And that's the concept, is to work through it slowly not jump to it so that we have a good outcome for Palo Alto. Because we wouldn't want to be in a situation where we're frankly outvoted by our neighbors and all the housing is dumped on us. And I can tell you at the last when I went through the process of how we do the allocation at the Northern California state level through ABAG, we had to fight back efforts of a huge number of people thought Palo Alto should get a large housing allocation because we had good schools. And they wanted to make one of the really strong factors was your API scores for your schools. And, that would have given Palo Alto, and I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like an extra 1,500 units at the time, because they did all these spreadsheets where they'd show, if you do this, your city gets this. And the people that had school districts with lower API scores, they're like, oh, we get a lot less housing. And so, what you've got to remember is that there's regional politics not only in Santa Clara on this, there's regional politics throughout all of Northern California on this. And it's very complicated. And we got to be a little careful because we get a much worse result if we're not careful on the process.
Let's see, just last comments focusing on existing units. Number one, I think it does call for making sure that we get a steady flow of the background demographics and economic statistics that are part of the housing element. Two, I thought Councilmember Scharf had a good point about granny units, and it certainly is worth looking at that, of small units in the backyard that could make a difference.
Microphone, please.
Yeah, sorry. Just supporting the granny unit idea. And third thing, I think the Buena Vista is out there in the community, and if there is a problem utilizing this effectively in our housing element or on the existing unit side, we should be given an articulate position of why not. So look forward to that as we move on. Any last comments? Yes. Cara.
Since so many of the members of the public are here, I did want to clarify the application of Buena Vista to the existing 25% units. If we are able to classify it as a qualifying housing development that has some existing deed restriction on it, and we wanted to utilize it as preservation of existing affordable housing, we would have to, that's not the end of the analysis. We would still have to meet all of the other criteria in the memo, which is, we would have to come up with a program to protect it, whether it be buying the project or financing a third party to provide it, to acquire the project, and also to, of course, deed restrict it further.
Thank you. No other comments?
Question?
Yes.
But the whole issue on the Buena Vista property, though, at this point is, what role, can we define a role for ourselves that looks at it in the context of the housing element when at this stage there's a contractual relationship between a developer and the owner, and they're going through trying to get approvals related to the completeness of some of their relocation studies and that broader issue. So I guess my question is, at what point or how soon can we look at these other alternatives? Because that issue and the status of that property is still not clear. And so, the idea of, this sort of protecting the site, coming up with another configuration, is it a public-private partnership? Should we be involved? All of these issues that are very important ones, seems to me we're in a situation where some of our discussion is constrained by the current status of the property. Could someone respond to that?
I think that is the case, but I think what I'd like to do is respond in writing, do some research and really lay out for you what the situation is instead of, speaking off the cuff. It is it's complicated. So before your next meeting, we'll try and put a memo together on this subject and on the subject of the granny units.
I also support that, the granny units, as a possibility. There are a lot of different models for using that in different communities.
Great. There are no motions, but I think some clear questions. Thank you very much, and let's move on to item 2.
Yes. Hi. Good afternoon. This next item is about the housing element work plan update, or updating the work plan status and how staff proposes to do community outreach as part of the housing element process. Let me go ahead and start first about talking about the revised work plan status, and then we'll talk about public participation in a bit. But as the updated timeline or work plan starts on basically page number 4. And what we have done is try to fill in some of the blanks, if you will, in that we will have some more definitive dates, and starting with our community kickoff workshops, which we are scheduling for late March, early April. In addition, from the previous draft that you had reviewed, we also now included a community panel and proposed times and subjects, which the community panel and the RHMC would discuss for the next approximately 11 months. Also would like to, but want to also let you know that this timeline will be constantly revised as we get closer to each benchmark date. We are in the process, we have chosen a housing element consultant, and the consultant has submitted a proposed timeline. And this timeline was given to you prior to the submittal of the housing element consultant's timeline, and so some of these dates may change to help accommodate the consultant's timeline. So, but this is basically our most up-to-date guess, if you will, for how we plan to meet that January 31st, 2015 date. Questions, or would you like me to go on to the public participation? Okay. And staff proposes to do a number of community outreach measures in preparation of the housing element. Our first would be starting off with 2 proposed community workshops, which would introduce the housing element update process to the community. Right now we're proposing to do 2 community workshops, one in South Palo Alto, one in North Palo Alto, and at different times to try to catch as many persons as possible. It is proposed that the hired housing consultant would lead the community workshop, and as part of the community workshop also have developed an online or a web-based survey tool that we can also gauge additional or receive additional input from the community about housing issues and also maybe about housing data. We will also be putting together a housing element community panel, and I believe attachment A is the proposed list. Staff has already begun contacting potential community panel members, and also members of the community have approached the department about possibly being included in the community panel. And the community panel will be meeting once a month, probably at the lower half of each month after each regional housing mandate committee, as the timeline shows. Other public outreach measures or public participation measures are focus groups, depending on what the results from the survey come in. If there is a perceived need or a perceived outreach to a focus group, whether that be senior citizens or persons with disabilities, or there can be a variety of groups, but the focus group outreach would be partially based on the comments received during the community workshops and the surveys. And also, staff is putting together an interactive site selection tool, in that we know we need to find an additional 600 plus units. And what staff is proposing is picking out certain sites as a staff proposal. This is how staff proposes to get to that 600 unit benchmark. However, this interactive tool will allow the public to come in and say, oh, we don't like the sites that staff has chosen, and we would like to use these sites. And if they choose these sites, it will show whether the pros and cons of selecting this site. As part of it, the site selection tool will be based on this map in front of you. What this map shows is all the areas that cannot be built on, basically. In other words, all these areas in brownish.
There's a handheld mic.
Okay. The maps. Hello. Okay. The maps show where there are the possibility or potential for multifamily or a density up to 20 units per acre, and the areas in gray or grayish brown are primarily R1 sites, PF sites, which are public facilities, and other zoning districts that cannot accommodate multifamily or higher density developments. And so for the most part, you can see that the multifamily or the higher density opportunities are along El Camino, the downtown area, and RP, which is Research Park. Multifamily or housing is allowed with the conditional use permit. The same applies to the ROLM zones, which is east of Highway 101. Oh, excuse me. Those are also allowed for multifamily housing with a conditional use permit. But those areas by right generally are, again, along El Camino, a little bit on San Antonio Avenue, and basically downtown. There are some other areas that are zoned for multifamily, but are built out, and those would include the parcels along Sand Hill Road and this stretch along Alma. So as you can see, there are sites, but it's relatively, as a percentage of the city, a small percentage of land mass, if you will. And this interactive tool will help work, saying, staff may propose these sites to meet our 600 units, but if you do not feel those aren't appropriate sites, then you can choose other sites. However, you must know that choosing these other sites, there are these issues associated with them, whether that be a rezone is necessary and maybe additional environmental review, or so that will be part of this interactive tool that the community may also take a look and participate in the site selection process. But again, that tool will be based on this map and its constraints. And also, the city will be updating its housing element website that will have links to HCD and ABAG, in addition to whatever documents or meetings are held. It'll hold. It'll provide notices for that, so that the public may be constantly apprised of the housing element update process. And that concludes staff's presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Before we go to questions, let me go to the public. Herb Borak.
Yeah, thank you. I think it'd be helpful to have the map available online even before it's an interactive tool, so people could start thinking about it. I also know that this schedule is very tight, but there are other things that are going on that are related that also have their own schedules. For example, the California Avenue concept plan is going on a schedule that I think is also headed towards November, and there's also doing a study of downtown as well that's been required by reaching a certain limit of office development. And comprehensive plan needs to be internally consistent, and it would seem that if there are housing opportunity sites, whether it's downtown or in the area being studied in the California Avenue plan, that these need to come together at the same time in order to meet the deadline for this study for the affordable housing allocations numbers. And the difficulty we have is that if those other studies lag, then that can be used as a reason for saying, oh, well, you can't use those areas because we haven't finished that study yet. So that's a question of both planning resources and also of council policy setting, that it's going to may have to be making decisions in deciding these housing quota to meet the housing quota by the certain deadline, whether or not those other studies are done, and you will be impacting those areas when you're choosing those numbers. I mean, I don't think it's proper to use it as an excuse that you haven't finished the California Avenue study and you haven't finished the downtown office study to say that somehow those areas have to be set aside and can't be used when you're determining your housing quota sites. Because otherwise, if you want to bring them all together, it's going to be an 8-year process instead of a 4-year process. I don't know if you want to do that. Another concern I have is the fact that over the years, about 14 years, I guess it is now, that we've lost some history. That is, it's been hard, as you've noticed with the Terman Apartments situation, for example, that information has gotten into the housing element that we're now told is not correct. And in the previous housing element, we were told about the Terman Apartments that state law requires those projects to, if they want to get out of having that responsibility, to offer their units to organizations like the Housing Corporation that would save them. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to council for questions, comments. Councilmember Price.
Thank you. I appreciate your presentation. Just a clarification question. We have this ongoing community effort on our Palo Alto effort. To what degree is this embedded or not embedded with that, or is it running in parallel? Because some of these efforts, clearly are related. This is related to some of the points made by her.
Thank you, Councilmember Price. I think, as we've articulated to the council, the Our Palo Alto initiative is really an organizing principle for a series of events and meetings, as well as actions that we'll be bringing to council and the comp plan update process. So I see the community engagement that Tim has articulated happening here, being coordinated and falling inside that framework. So we're going to have to work hard to help people understand how all of these initiatives relate to each other. I think the last speaker made a good point. We have all these things going on in parallel. Some of them are going to get to the finish line faster than others. We have to be able to explain that, why that is, and how the relationships work.
Thank you. And can you tell us who the consultant was that was chosen for the update of the housing element?
I don't think we've executed a contract yet, but we did. We got 2 proposals.
Okay.
We can tell you the proposers were MIG and Diet and Bhatia. So
okay, great.
two
Good.
Very respected.
They're both very good.
Planning
Okay.
firms.
The other question I have is that I'm assuming in that contract that the consultant would bring forward best practices, issues that have been used successfully elsewhere, so that we can bring some new ideas to the table. I'm assuming that. Is that correct? Good, okay. It is my personal belief that a lot of our infrastructure improvements and even parking garages and other ideas have been used, in conjunction with housing. And there are other communities that have done that quite successfully. Will there be part of this process or not? My phrase du jour is learned community. So what I'm saying is, in these working with the team here and the community, will there be learning sessions that help bring people a little bit up to speed regarding strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, housing products, micro units? There are just many, many, many other types of housing products which we haven't really talked about here. I'm having trouble, and I've done this for 20 years, to figure out where is the place for that discussion.
Well, thank you, Councilmember Price. I think actually that's one of the beauties of our Palo Alto organizing principle, because we're going to be able to convene this panel, have a Housing Element 101 kind of training session for the panel, but we'll also be able to point them towards community events that are happening around good design and trends in population and demographics, things that might be happening outside of this planning process, but that will be available as resources to people who are interested in these issues.
And is this the venue to make recommendations about topics related to innovative building materials and practices, for example?
Sure.
Okay, well, that's a start. Thank you.
Councilmember Holman?
Yes, thank you for this, and I like some of the approaches that you've taken here. A few questions. So I noticed that the Housing Element Community Panel, which I much appreciate, is not filled in as to who the representatives are, but February 27 is when the panel is supposed to convene. So I'm wondering 2 things. One is, how were the representatives chosen? Was it self-selecting? Was it staff selected? How was the outreach done? So that, and then I'm going to give you a lot of questions at once here and just answer them one at a time.
Oh, let me answer that one quickly. I think we wanted to get the committee's input on the organization of this panel, and then our thought was we'll immediately, next week, send out invitations. If we can convene it by the 27th, that'd be great. If not, it'll just slip a week or 2. Our concept is that this committee meets towards the beginning of the month. We would want the panel to meet towards the end of the month. So if the committee thinks that this list of interest groups and participants, it looks good, we're going to send out invitations and contact folks and get the names filled in as fast as we can.
Yeah, it's the 13th. And you'll publicize this how? Like, will you do a press release and letting people know that this is available, or how will you get the word out?
I think we were going to do it really word of mouth and reaching out to people that we know to be interested. As Tim mentioned, we've already been contacted by some folks who are interested. We'll get in touch with PAN, for example, and see if they have some members who want to participate. I think we're going to be pretty informal about it because we expect these meetings also to be public meetings. So if someone doesn't actually make it onto the panel, they're still welcome to come and participate.
That was one of my questions. Were these meetings going to be public and held where and publicized how?
We're still working that out. I mean, I think it's going to be via our website, and we're going to have to figure out the meeting location. It may even be in this room, but we'll be working all that out. We thought the first step was to get your buy-in on this concept, and then pull the trigger and start organizing it pretty fast.
We certainly have my buy-in on the concept. I think sometimes we rely on the city's website. I mean, you want this information on the website, but I think sometimes we rely on it too much to think that people are going to go there all the time and see what's happening. I think it needs to be, the meetings need to be publicized beyond that, definitely beyond that. The Housing Element 101, you'd mentioned, and I don't want to take this literally, but I just want to make sure, you said the Housing Element 101 for the panel. I think that's something that really should be publicized broadly. The community has a lot of perceptions and some misperceptions, and we could all use all the education we can get about the frustrations as well as the stated intentions of having housing mandates. So I think that, particularly that first meeting, you want to publicize pretty broadly. And see if it can be televised actually and recorded, because I think it's something you want to capture. Because I'm sure you'll do a good job of talking about that. The map, how best to make that available, I'm not exactly sure, but we don't want to hide it in City Hall. And if it's online, that's great, but there's a lot of detail to that, so I think it needs to be distributed like at libraries and that sort of thing so people can really see it. Of course, these community groups will have it too, but it needs to be somehow or other made more available in a form that's really usable. And I would actually like to have one myself to look at, and maybe the other committee members would too. You wanted comments on the composition? You know what? I don't want to take up too much time. Why don't I'll go to somebody else, and then we'll come back and get comments about the composition of the panel, if that's okay. I'm taking a lot of time here.
Why don't you just finish up what you want to do?
Okay, all right. In talking about how you're reaching out to get volunteers for this, obviously besides PAN, you're going to, and just, PAN is a broad participation, but they also have representatives, from different neighborhoods. So, but I don't think all neighborhoods. So just be aware of that, and it might be something to kind of be sensitive to. The persons with disabilities, I certainly have no problem with that. I just wasn't quite sure what the purpose of that one was. The affordable housing expert and city resident, I wasn't quite sure how you're going to find that person, because it says expert and city resident. So is that different than, say, a housing corp board member? I wasn't quite sure what that meant.
The purpose of the affordable housing expert, Palo resident, we actually have somebody in mind who has said okay, but that was just to provide expertise in affordable housing who happens to live in the city of Palo Alto.
So like community working group person, something like that?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. And that, again, differentiated from housing expert, that's
both affordable and market rate, because there is a difference in the development of the two.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think, Unified School Board District member and PTA member, so that's all fine. I don't think I have any other comments on this. It's a large group to convene. Good luck finding meeting dates. All right, thank you.
Thank you. So I guess I just wanted to run through the schedule and have a good sense of how this works. So obviously today we're doing the work plan and work plan status and outreach plan and use of existing units, which you're doing. Then at the March meeting, you're actually planning on bringing us demographics and site options, right? I assume when you meet with the community panel, you're going to basically lay out the basics, explain the housing element, that's the housing element 101 stuff, and how this all works. That'll be your introductory meeting. Are we going to look and start discussing which sites we should rezone? Is that, I'm not sure what demographics and site options mean.
I think we want to give you some background on housing need and affordability, you know, some of the data that goes into the housing element, and we're hoping to have this interactive tool to start the discussion about sites at your next meeting. And maybe it'll be like a trial run of this tool that then we can take out into the community later in the month.
Okay, so it's a trial run of the tool, and the tool's going to basically say, you change this to 20 units per acre, and again, I mean, is that basically the idea where you have this interactive tool and you change one thing and it shows up where we are in terms of our housing?
Correct. And if you choose to rezone, yes, you can rezone, but an EIR or, you know, environmental review, those type of pros and cons for each site.
And when you say demographics, what do you mean?
Every time you update your housing element, you have to do another pass through the quantification of need in the community.
It'll be updating with, 2010 census data. This is our percentages of persons under the poverty line or number of seniors.
Yes.
Correct.
You don't need any input on that.
No.
Just tell us it's going to be. Okay.
This is
It's
where
one of-
we are.
Yeah, it's one of the building blocks of the housing element.
And then you do an info report to council, and what does that consist of? We haven't done anything yet.
I
It's
think.
all been, you know, interactive and.
I think our thought was that we would all benefit from keeping the entire council informed. The thought was here that we would give them that 2010 census data, everything we've compiled, and as Tim said, this may be adjusted a little bit based on the consultant's availability. It may be that work slips because while we need it at the end of the game, we don't need it to do the hard work of the site's selection. So, but our thought was that, you know, right after we get the panel convened and get started would be a good time to tell the full council what we're up to.
So then in March 27th is when you take that demographic and site options that you came to us with to the community panel. You go through the same stuff. You have the same interactive tool. And you do the same thing basically.
Correct.
Yeah. And then you do other community input. That's when you go out into the community, do the surveys, get the stakeholder interviews, which is great. All that information. And then in April 1st, you submit to HCD your housing element annual performance, right? Mm-hmm. And I assume you're going to be doing okay on that, or?
Yeah, that's something we do every year. We have to send this report card, whether it's kind of unrelated to our housing element, but it tells them how we're doing on the production of housing in Palo Alto.
So Maybell was originally in the housing element. That situation changed, obviously. Does that have an effect on that report? And do we come back? Or is there anything we need to do on that this year?
We actually technically, I don't think, have to report on the sites. We're going to finesse that a little bit. We do have to report on the status of our programs and how many units we've produced. So we're going to be looking carefully at what the actual requirements are, and that's what we'll be doing.
So then we come back to the housing committee, and site options continue, housing element revisions. What are we doing then? Are we actually getting more into the details of which sites? And you're actually, at that point, you've now suggested sites as opposed to just training us for the first meeting.
We hope we're going to be getting closer on sites, you know, starting to narrow down what's acceptable and what wouldn't be acceptable. And we're also thinking at that point we'll actually have a track changes version of our current housing element showing where we think we need to update policies and programs. And including with it the checklist that HCD is requiring that we submit with the housing element. So you start to see what that tool looks like. They've, you know, given us a checklist we have to fill out. Our consultant's going to do it for us, so we're going to, you know, start working with that tool.
And then we're going to go back to the community panel, go through the site options. Then we go to the PTC, right? And which takes to the PTC is where we are so far in the process.
Correct.
And possibly the.
Then we get the input.
Draft.
Yeah, and possibly the track changes version of the housing element that we shared with the committee.
Yeah.
So then we get the PTC's input community panel input today on the May 15th meeting, right?
Maybe the June.
It may be the June meeting. I mean, we're still kind of working this out, but that's the idea. In the May-June timeframe, you start to hear from the commission and from the community panel how things are going with them on these issues.
So, and that's really what I was getting to. So, I was trying to figure out if it's going to be, we have a meeting here, we go to the community says, you know, we're interested in this. Is it two parallel processes and then you give us the community input at the end, or is it an interactive process where you say to us, well, the community is interested in doing this, and we say, well, you know, we're interested in that, or no, we don't think for these reasons, or at the end, is you have a community report that comes to us and then comes to the full council. I mean, is it interactive between us, what you hear there and what you hear here, or you keep them separate? I'm trying to figure that out.
Well,
Or do you not decide?
I guess I'm sort of an optimistic person. I kind of think we're going to be all in the same track. I don't see a lot of dispute here until we get down to, you know, real specific sites. You know, maybe some people want one site and some people want another. But
well, no, that's what I suspect. I suspect that, you know, you may have a thing where the community says we want this site. We're looking at different sites, and the PTC is looking at third sites.
Right.
I guess I was wondering if it's interactive, where when you start narrowing down sites, you say, well, the community's thinking of these sites, you give us an update of that, or if it's going to be, at the end of when you say to the community work group, we're done with your input, thank you very much, here's your report, here's your recommendation to this committee. Same with the PTC, here's the PTC's recommendation to this committee, and then we say, this is our recommendation, and you go to council with all three recommendations, or is it an interactive process between all the bodies? That's really where I'm going.
it's a good question, and we haven't really said it has to be one way or the other. I'm thinking all of these are public meetings. There are going to be people who are real junkies and want to go to all of them, and so there'll be some overlap and some back and forth.
So I would at least like to know, I don't want to attend all the meetings. I don't attend all the meetings. I don't want to go to the PTC meeting, have to go to that. You know, I don't think that's appropriate. So what I would also like to see is an info at each meeting summarizing what occurred at both the PTC and the community stakeholder group. So we're kept informed of what they're thinking along the way.
That's a great idea. I was actually going to suggest that there be a standing agenda item like the one we're discussing here, that's the work plan status and public outreach. And we could use it to talk about any changes that are happening to the schedule and to report on what we're learning from the other interactions.
Could I follow up to that? Do you mind, Greg?
Yeah, as long as you have to come back to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not taking your floor, I'm just following up to that. We do have a planning commission liaison to this group, so and I'm assuming this is what you're thinking, but just to be sure that the person on your committee should be that same planning commissioner. Does that make sense? So there's some continuity?
I don't know, if we have a different planning commissioner, we might get a different perspective. So there might be a benefit to having two planning commissioners who are educated along the way as we work on this.
That's okay. That leads to the second point I was going to make as follow-up to this is if it's the same planning commissioner, great, they're already on this. If it's a second one, then I think we ought to have two alternates from the planning commission here so that we can get that feedback or at least think about that. And then also, if there are, again, because as Greg says we don't want to go to all of these meetings. I mean, we're already meeting to death. But is there any thought about having a couple of chairs of this group, and those chairs can at least alternate in or rotate in to this meeting so that we can get the direct input from them? And the reason is because well, it's a follow-up. I'm almost done. The reason is because we get the feedback directly, and also because sometimes we're criticized because everything gets filtered through staff as opposed to hearing directly from the community members. So just think about those.
So I actually, I feel like I respond to that. I actually think that would be an appropriate approach. I think that you have a broad committee that you're dealing with, and I think staff needs to say, as opposed to if you have one person come from the committee, they would give their perspective. And I feel that way a little bit about the planning commission as well. I think I want to hear from staff what the outcome of those meetings were. I don't want to necessarily hear from a particular person on the committee, which would color their view of it. And staff may have a colored view of it too. I would rather have staff's view. That's what we have staff for. Getting back to that, So I wanted to go through what we did, and then when I get to the September meeting, basically you're looking for us to decide as a group on a draft recommendation to council. At which point we do the draft update, secret up, talk, the possible consultation with HCD. I was a little unclear on that. Were you expecting HCD to consult with the committee? I mean, I wasn't sure what you were thinking. Maybe you could tell us.
Yeah, we actually have possible consultation with HCD earlier in the schedule too. We have it in June. It may make sense to even do it earlier based on what the consultant is telling us. But this is just in case there are dangling issues out there. Like, there's one site we included, they don't believe us, we're still arguing with them. This is an opportunity for us to.
But you're on the phone with HCD and you tell us HCD is not going to be okay with this site. For these reasons, you're going to have to do this, right? I just want to make sure we're not going to be talking to HCD. You're going to come back to us and say, we've discussed these sites with HCD, we have these issues.
That's right.
Okay. Then we do the draft recommendation, get a community panel discussion, and then this is the part where I think we need to fix it. It says we do a final recommendation to council on draft update and secret document. And then you have a county community panel recommendation. In many ways, I would like to know the community panel recommendation and the planning commission recommendations before we make a final recommendation to council. I think we need to include their input. It's hard to include their input if they're not meeting after. That was my real push to the end of this.
Yeah, that is a great point. We will make that change, and as you see, we put this together before we knew the council's break was in July, so we have to fuss with this end of the schedule anyway. We'll make that change.
That might work better.
And with that, I want to say, I thought you guys did a great job in outlining this.
Thank you.
And I actually thought you did a good job on the stakeholder group. I think it's really important that we don't try and influence as council who you choose. I think that's a staff decision. I think it's much better. We're not interviewing the people, we're not. And I think it's not appropriate for this committee to be saying you should do this person or that person. And I think you have a good cross-section of the community. I frankly didn't see anyone who seemed left out. I mean, there may be, and I'm very not apologize, but maybe my colleagues, if they see a group that's left out, I think that's a different issue. I don't think we should be saying who that would be, how that would look like.
Thank you. Let me make a few comments. First, as chair, I think it's very important we all recognize that the goal of this is in October this committee has to make their final recommendation. That the deadlines for council to act on this is November, early December, so our work has to be completed in October. Everything we do up to then has to be driven by that goal in mind. So this is a panel, a committee that has a clear directive to achieve that. I want to go to a comment made by Mr. Borak about the decisions we're going to be making. One is identify housing sites. We don't have a comp plan, updated comp plan. We don't have the downtown study, and we don't have the California Avenue study. One of the striking things about our last housing element is that the two areas that seem most appropriate for dense mixed-use development, the downtown and the California Avenue, each got very small shares of the housing sites. About 20% in the downtown SOFA area, about 20% in the California Avenue, and 44% on the South El Camino. One of the issues that came up in the November election is putting dense housing there might isolate people, that the options and alternatives that are open to them on those sites are less than they are in either the California Avenue or downtown. So that implies we should be making decisions about allocation of housing sites before we have the development study of downtown, California Avenue development plan, or the comp plan studies. Now, that puts a burden on us to be making those decisions, but I think it is a necessity that we explicitly deal with where the allocation of housing units should be. The council has had only two major votes in the last 3 or 4 years about overall development process. In the June 2010, the council gave a directive when talking about height and breaking through the 54 limit that it should be done very close to transit, quarter mile, half mile of transit. In the rail corridor study, the council explicitly said the two downtowns, California Avenue and the downtown area, should be mixed use, denser developments. Now, both of those seem to be saying something different than the housing numbers that came up in the 2014 housing element, and I think that should be a subject of discussion right off the bat when we talk about demographics and site options. So it's not the detailed site options, but it is the general allocation of sites.
If I can just interject, I mean, I think that points to a really interesting issue, which is our interactive tool should be built to include existing sites so that the committee and the public can understand the implications. If we want to eliminate some of the existing sites because we think they're in the wrong place or the concentration is inaccurate or not as good as it should be, then we're going to have to find even more new sites. And so I hope the tool will be able to illustrate how the challenge gets even greater when we do that.
I think the PTC in their, was it December meeting, said that 20 to 50% of square footage development in the California Avenue should be residential. That's a pretty clear statement and gives us some mandate to work on. But anyway, I think that will be a subject matter very quickly for this committee. Now, I agree with everything that Council Member Sharp said about the pacing of the thing, and I would just emphasize even more that we have to be able to use the material coming from the community panel, from the surveys, from the focus groups, whatever they are, effectively in this committee. And the thing we need is some concrete results from them coming to us, and maybe we should be identifying contentious issues that we feed to them and say, please deal with this issue at your next meeting. I am concerned that we're going to ask Council in October to vote on this, and we need to keep them on board. Now, you have a Council information report on March 24th before very much happens. You want to give them some background data. That's all right. But I think there should be something of substance to them in the April-May period, saying, here are the issues we run into, here are a couple questions you might have. Doesn't have to be the whole thing, but there should be some way of getting them involved in what might be the major issues. So more council feedback, and at a time where we begin to develop information, they get pulled into it. The same is true at the detail level when you have community panel meetings or go out with surveys, that some of the questions you take to them are the questions that we might be raising here. And then we get their responses in an appropriate way. Not just that this group discussed it, but gee, they divided. There was a dissension in this committee, and here are the points of view that were expressed in that committee. Okay, so I guess summarize what I've said, number one, I think the general issues of site selection have to coincide with our best information about council objectives for the city. And we need to do the best job we can of taking those into account when we make any site selection. Two, that we have, I loved your idea about having a work plan on the agenda each time. So there we can talk about what issues have come up, how you're feeding them into both the community panel and the surveys and workshops and other outreach, and then how we can feed back to them the issues we think are important and significant. So that dynamic of going back and forth, I think, is critical. So, Dana, do you have comments?
This is Dana Tom, Palo School Board member. I appreciate that the community panel includes a school board member as well as somebody to represent parents, whether it's from the PTA or not, but that's good. I just wanted to throw out one, a separate idea that you're welcome to just take as a suggestion, because I do see that you identify certain groups to get input from, and I'm wondering whether it would be helpful to have an understanding of what opinions are from, say, long-term residents versus people who are newer residents, to understand what attracted them to Palo Alto, why did they move here? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a separate focus group, but it could be through your survey or other things that you can disaggregate that data to get a picture of that.
Thank you. Let's see. Public speaker, Cheryl Williams.
I'm feeling a little disorganized with these comments because this is the first time I've been at this meeting. But just as a reflection of some of the things that happened during the Measure D campaign, I wanted to make sure that the people who were on the Housing Element Community Panel were not joint members of one another's boards of directors, just because there was a lot of crossover. So maybe that could be discussed. And the other thing was, I am concerned about what you were talking about, the housing element in California Avenue. I don't understand what the pathway is if the University Avenue downtown and California plan are going to take longer. How does this process feed into that process? I just don't get it, how that would work. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, I guess there have been a lot of input. I think it would be helpful if we gave a chance for one more round. Maybe we can start with staff and give 2 minutes to each person.
I just wanted to respond to the question, and I believe the chair had the same question about the interaction between these planning processes. There is a requirement that the comprehensive plan be internally consistent. So one of the things we're going to have to do with the housing element, because that's going to come first, is identify any other conforming changes to other sections of the comp plan that we'll have to follow. And luckily, we have a comp plan update happening at the same time, so any changes we identify, we'll be able to incorporate into the update process. And so when we're done with all of this work, we should have an internally consistent comp plan that reflects our common vision.
Okay, 2-minute comments. Councilmember Scharf, do you want to?
I don't want to kick it off.
Okay. You don't want to speak? Or?
No, I may want to speak, but I'm not ready to kick it off yet. You can go to someone else first.
Councilmember Price?
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to make comments about things I forgot to say before. And the list of representatives, I think it's really important to get some people on this group that are under the age of 35. Who really are facing housing issues here in a way that many of us may or may not be relating to. The other issue is, it gets a little more sensitive too on some of this, but the issue of renters, right? Are we assuming that renters are in the mix? And you know, when you talk about having representation of mixed income, that's a little more sensitive. But, you know, the service worker who's 25 has some issues, and then, you know, a high-tech worker, age 25, with a really, perhaps, important, you know, really much higher rate of income is something else. The other issue, I'm just assuming this is happening, but just to make the point, the issue of the sites as they relate to transportation, as they relate to mobility, as they relate to current and planned transportation improvements. I mean, El Camino, as we all know, is a corridor for bus rapid transit, and that's just assuming that that will be part of the mix when you're looking at this. I mean, none of these sites you can look at, as you know very well, in a unidimensional way. There are a lot of other factors which I know you already know. The other question was, you stated it, I was hoping that this could go, your conversations with HCD will happen early and hopefully often, so they can do like an early read. I don't know if they have the staff to do that, but it's built in here, because I think that would be very helpful as you refine. And also, if we have names of other groups, like informal groups, like the Alliance for Livable Palo Alto, should we just give you those names? Other people may want to give you names of other groups who may have individuals who have interest and concerns that they want expressed. So that's one, as an example. It's a more informal linkage of individuals with different kinds of expertise. The Alliance for Livable Palo Alto. Those are my main comments. I think this looks very promising, and it's very exciting, and I think this will be really, really great.
Good. Anyone else like to quick? Councilmember Holman.
Yeah, just a couple. I support certainly Councilmember Price's inclusion of renters and the other age group. The local business representative, just a question about that is, I'm presuming that's an employer. Okay, so just clarification on that. The thing I brought up about a chair from this, or chair co-chairs from this group, is you know, the role of a chair is to represent the group, not to represent one's individual perspective. So just think about that and how that might be represented here, because I have seen it several times where, you know, staff gets accused of having staff's interpretation of what the group's perspective is. So I just thought it would be a little more transparent if we did it the other way. And then the other thing is having to do with the timing of the housing element versus the comp plan update. What the challenge is here is we have an existing comp plan, and while some things about it do need to be updated, we do have, I think, largely a very good comp plan. So my concern is that we don't let the new housing element just, you know, hijack what the outcomes are for a comp plan update, and that's a real challenge because of the timing of this. But you know, in a perfect world, we'd be doing the overall planning and then having this be one of the things that comes out of that. So I just want to encourage staff to be sensitive to our existing comp plan and the qualities and policies in it that have been what the community has been living by and expecting for all these years. Understand that there may be some things that have to change to address this, but I just don't want this to be the driver. It's backwards. So, okay, thanks.
Tom?
Yeah, just briefly. I also would support the inclusion of a renter as a separate category. And I'm struggling a little bit with the local business representative as well. I think Councilmember Holman made a good point. You know, one of the interesting things is we should probably have, you know, one of the bigger employers in town, frankly, as one of these categories, you know, and get that perspective. I mean, you know, I'm not saying it should be Palantir, for instance, but they're, you know, they employ huge numbers of people. It could be HP. I mean, they employ a huge number of people. It could be Varian. They employ a huge number of people. And that's really different than having like a local business representative. Like if you go to the Chamber of Commerce, you know, it's a different group. And so I wasn't sure. I almost thought both types of employers should be, you know, the typical kind of employer you'd find at the Chamber of Commerce versus the Palantirs, the HPs, you know, and their take on this, given that most of the people that are actually employed, and that you'd obviously want the people that are employed to live in the city. You know, that cuts down on traffic, and that actually meets the goal of a housing, jobs, and balance issue. So you probably want to get that perspective. And so I actually would add, I don't know if you break it into two categories or what you're thinking, but I actually think that we should have two categories there. One more of, I don't know quite how to phrase it, but one more of the Chamber of Commerce type business representatives, which they're probably going to expect, who's normally on there, and then have you reach out to one of the major employers. I guess I would call it a major employer category. So I would add two categories. I'd add the major employer category and the renter category as two additional ones.
Just a quick comment on the listing. Maybe just instead of getting employers and business people, we ought to have workers, employees, and maybe especially maybe a focus group or something of employees who do not live in Palo Alto, and what would it take to get them to live here? What are they looking for in the city to move, since we're talking about building housing? Other than that, though, I support a lot of what came in. I think you have a diversity of comments and perspectives, and we look forward to the next meeting. Okay, with that, let's move on to any general committee member questions or announcements, comments. Councilmember Holman.
Well, just to kind of follow up on what I mentioned earlier during the first item is would like any comments that staff might have, just briefly now because we can't discuss it, but just put on the table that this body might be the representative body to our state legislators, so that we have a united voice that's going forward to them, as opposed to individual council members going one off talking to our legislators. It's not efficient for either the legislators or council members. So any thoughts that staff might have next meeting or presently, that's fine.
Okay, any comments from staff? Summing up.
Well, I just maybe we could confirm the next meeting's agenda at this juncture. I have a request for maybe an info report, a memo to the committee that wouldn't necessarily require a conversation, but about the granny unit issue and the mobile home park, and then action items, actually discussion items related to the work plan status and outreach update, and the beginning of this conversation about demographics and the sites analysis. So would the committee like to add this third discussion topic of legislative advocacy?
Well, I think that we do have an issue. I don't think this committee has the authority to have that role without council approval. Council is the only one that has the legislative advocacy authority, and this committee doesn't have the authority to go off and have a position and advocate for it, or tell other council members that they can't advocate first time. So I don't think we can do that.
Well, I guess the question is, the committee could make a request to the council.
Yes.
That it's an important thing. Councilmember Price.
Aren't we having the item of a state lobbyist coming forward to us? I believe it's policy and services. So it seems to me the state lobbyist decision and, the representatives by the council that work with the League of Cities and other ways also may be a way to address some of these concerns too. So I think that conversation about the potential state lobbyist, what is the kind of agenda they're going to be working on. And we also have the city manager's office who does update us regarding, the status of some of the legislation and pending legislation. So I think there are ways that it can be pulled together. And we do need to be representing the city as a whole.
So I'm concerned about mission creep.
I think the goal of the idea is to get a unified voice for the council. So we should work through regular council procedures, and maybe if there already is an item with the policy and services, that should be a starting point.
Okay, so we won't put that on the agenda, but, we're happy to.
Just a comment, though, you did say that we would have an agenda item on updated work plan each time.
Yes.
So that would be included.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, anything further on future meetings? Okay, we had a full meeting today, and I'm sure we'll have a full meeting tomorrow,
So the only thing on the granting units, I think it might be nice if we could have it as a discussion item, because otherwise we just read it and then we may want to have two agendas. It might just be easier to just, you might come back to us and say it makes no sense. That's fine, and then we can have a short discussion.
Just as perhaps a help for staff, there was a large discussion about this and consideration that was not supported by the community at that point in time, but gosh, that would have been 2008, maybe. So you might want to look back at Planning and Transportation Commission. Yeah.
We've learned a lot since then, Karen.
We have, but I mean, rather than starting from scratch and, so.
Okay, thank you. With that, the meeting is adjourned.